Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care and CHSE professional learning session, which is about promoting student engagement in blended courses. And today's speaker would be Greg Kroll from the CLM Teaching and Learning Unit. Thank you, Greg, for being able to present the session.
Hi, Giannis. Thank you very much, and thank you to you and your team for inviting me to present today. As Giannis said, my name is Greg Kroll, and I'm from the CLM Teaching and Learning Unit. This afternoon, I'm going to be sharing a conceptual presentation based on a review of some of the key literature and frameworks around student engagement, supported by my own experiences working in the CLM faculty as a learning designer in the past few years, and looking at how we can deal with the challenges of low student engagement and promoting, particularly as we move towards a more blended learning and teaching approach in the university. As I said, I'm from a different faculty, and I know learning and teaching in health sciences does happen a bit differently, but I'm hopeful that at least some of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, you can apply in your own context. So the first thing is to think about is, what do we mean by student engagement? And the definition I like to use is from Trowler, that talks about student engagement being concerned with the interaction between the time, the effort, and any other relevant resources that is invested by both students and the institutions intended to optimize or improve the learning experience, or support the learning experience so that students are able to be more successful in the learning experience. So we're looking at both students achieving their intended learning outcomes, as well as students being able to think about or to have support in terms of developing their own study skills over time. So we're going to particularly looking today in the case of courses that are offered in a blended mode. So there's some aspect of the course that is facilitated online, and there's some aspect of the course that is facilitated face-to-face, and those two then need to be integrated. So I thought I'd start by looking at, in terms of some of the challenges in student engagement in our context. So obviously a major challenge in the last 2 years has been the disruption related to the COVID pandemic. But even more generally before that, in South African higher education, we do have to deal with the issue of very low throughput rates generally in universities, and universities looking at how do we better support our students to ensure that they're more successful. Then in terms of our own context, and particularly in the light of the load shedding catastrophe that we're experiencing at the moment, we have to deal many students facing issues related to lack of connectivity, lack of stable electricity, or being in home study environments that are just not conducive. And even as we come onto WITS, because of, for example, coming onto campus on our campuses, issues related to load shedding, electricity, Wi-Fi means that potentially these are not always as supportive and enabling as they could be. One of the other challenges, particularly in moving to a blended learning approach, is that often, at least initially, there's often a challenge in terms of adapting and looking at which technologies to make use of, how to make use of them, and then support the learning and teaching at that time. And so often the initial focus becomes thinking about the focus on getting the technology, getting access to the technology, getting the technology right, whereas perhaps limiting the humanizing aspect of learning and teaching at that time. And then our view of learning is often seen as a social phenomenon. So in other words, we see learning happening through collaboration, through interaction between students. And again, that's a challenge, particularly in terms of traditional teaching methods. We are reliant on sort of lecturing to students, but many people, particularly in the online component of blended learning, feel that they have no idea whether their students are there, whether they're paying attention, whether they're learning. And students similarly might feel that if they're reaching out to lecturers using online methods such as discussions or emails or Teams or everything, they might feel that their lecturer is not there, and so they have this issue in terms of presence. And that's something we're going to look at in terms of how, through today, is looking in terms of how do we actually better facilitate interaction between students and their lecturers. Before I carry on, I thought I'd just like for you to just have an opportunity in the chat. You can just type in there, what are the other forms of major student engagement challenges that you've experienced in your courses? We can sort of focus on in the last 6 months or so. For you, what have been some of the major challenges in terms of student engagements that you faced in your particular courses, whether it's face-to-face, online, or blended? I'm just going to give you an opportunity in a minute just to think about that, and then if you're welcome to type some of your challenges in the chat. Okay, thanks. Aviva saying low student motivation, low drive. So I think that's also a challenge that we've seen, particularly for students, and again, coming out of disruption, but even before that, in terms of students, their own internal motivations for learning, and their sort of drive to succeed. Again, there's some, there's often in the university space, in courses, there's often a drive in terms of marks-driven sort of culture, so that if something hasn't got a mark associated with it, students very often may not be interested in looking at it. Then Mohammed is saying students' unwillingness to adapt to blended and a return to face-to-face. Again, that's also another challenge I think the university across faculties is facing, both staff, both students, academic staff, as well as students and support staff, in terms of thinking about, well, what does it mean to adapt to this blended environment? What does blended mean? How do I work through having different modes and integrating that? And understanding, and there's a wide range of students' perceptions around this, because some students really miss the face-to-face and they want everything to be face-to-face. Some students, because of their circumstances, because of who they are and their personalities and other things, enjoyed having the more flexibility, the online nature of the online mode, and now, as you said, struggle back to come onto campus. And I see Matthew saying that students are refusing to return to campus. So I think that's a challenge in terms of particularly going forward for us, in terms of thinking about the right approaches and the right modes to be used for students and what they make most sense of, whether to be online or face-to-face. And then Arshad is mentioning, which is a common experience, is that you have, and we saw this in our faculty again at the beginning of this year when we started to come back to face-to-face, huge attendance at the first few weeks of lectures, and then that drops sort of as the course progresses, it drops over time. We've also seen that, particularly when it comes to things like going to lectures and tutorials, often if there's assessments on that day, then students sort of focus on getting the assessments done rather than actually, and then miss out on those relevant lectures and tutorials. So you're welcome to continue to type in some of the challenges as we go through, and we'll pick up some of these, not all of them, and some of them are sort of major challenges that will take time to address, but some of them, there are some strategies that we can work towards. I'm just seeing, I see Avi with, again, yes. So again, when I was talking about different students having different perceptions, it does relate in terms of their personalities as well, in terms of some students being very much happy to engage and to speak out online, others sort of very much preferring to sort of lurk in the background, if I can say it like that. And again, I think also infrastructural issues in terms of things like having, Matty's just noted, to do a good HiFlex, you need venues that are equipped with the relevant infrastructure, and a lot of our venues, if it's don't have that capacity, as well as the staff being capacitated in terms of how to use those effectively. Okay, so let's move on in terms of looking at some of the ways in which we can approach some of these challenges. There are different ways of approaching it, but what we can look at today is a model that I found called the 5 C's. This is not based on a formal research paper, but is based on a sort of more informal news piece that I read, but I found it very useful in terms of thinking about, and I'm just going to put that into the chat, that if you want to, you can have a look at that article. In terms of thinking about student engagement, how can we better support and engage with our students in an online or blended space, and talks about, we're going to go through each one of these through connection, through consistency, through content, through community, and through compassion as well. And we're going to go through, look at each one of these in a bit more detail in the rest of the presentation. So the first C, or C1, is really about connection. And this is thinking about how do we as lecturers connect with our students. So students need to feel connected both to the course as to you as their lecturer or teaching assistant or whatever the role is, because this helps them to draw them in to feel that they have a sense of belonging, that this is a space that they are an active participant. And if students don't feel like they belong, then they are going to hang back and they are going to disengage. So we need to think about how do we help students to feel engaged. And one of the ways is to look at how do we recognize them as a person and not just as a student. For example, don't just seeing students as student numbers, but thinking about how do you demonstrate that there's care, that that the student feels like there's someone else on the either when they're talking to you in a face-to-face classroom, or if you're talking to in a team session, or there's someone writing to you in Ulwazi, for example, that there feels there's someone out there that cares for them, that understands the situation that they're in, and feels like it doesn't, if they just disappear, that no one is even going to notice. So if a student feels like that you as the lecturer are sort of are there for them, they're more likely to trust you, and then they're more likely to help stay connected and stay with the course and stay engaged in the course over time. Of course, the difficult thing is how do we do this as lecturers, because it's not such an easy, particularly when we're facing very often very large classes and very overloaded lecturers. So one of the things that we can look at, and this came out strongly during the pandemic, was this idea of a pedagogy of care approach. I'm building on the work here of Noddings and Bali, and this is really looking at an approach or perspective that looks at how do we help students to connect, and how do we show them care, and how do they receive that care. And essentially it's about recognizing the needs and sorry, we've just got load shed in the building, so I'm hoping that it's still okay. That's probably why you'll see now I've gone into darkness, because the lights have gone off. I'll probably turn my camera off. Yanis, I'm hoping that you can still hear me. Okay, there it seems to be readjusting. Yanis, I'm hoping you can hear me still okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'll just carry on. So the approach then, this is the approach that we've tried to use in the support that we provide to our lecturers and our faculty, in terms of adopting this approach of recognizing the needs and challenges that people have, listening to those and reflecting on them, and trying to be supportive where we can through the tools that we have available to us. So this takes an approach of modeling, firstly, by looking at we ourselves as lecturers modeling the approaches that we want our students to enact when it comes to learning. So when it comes to learning, what is it that we want to see? And we model those for our students so that they can engage with those as their students. Secondly, dialogue, very important, and in different formats, whether it's through face-to-face classes, whether it's through online discussions, that there's some form of reciprocal communication and feedback. So, I mean, often a complaint from students is say, oh, I emailed my lecturer and I didn't hear anything for a week or something like that. And that's the kind of responsiveness in terms of thinking about how do we actually engage in dialogue with our students, and do students feel that if they do reach out to us, there is some feedback that they're getting, and what sort of feedback is they're taking. The third aspect of the model is around practice, and this is thinking about how do we provide opportunities to practice what is learned through the activities that we provide, the learning activities, and through the assessments that we provide. So again, thinking about what kinds of learning activities is important and what kinds of assessments that we expect our students to do, and does that enable them to practice what it is that we are hoping for them to learn. And then finally, the last part is around confirmation, and that is looking at where students are succeeding, even if it's very small successes up front, is to provide affirmation in terms of what they're doing, in terms of what they've completed, to supporting them in terms of thinking about further, in terms of how they can go deep into things, and encouraging them to reflect. So one of the things that we try to do is encourage a reflective component to our courses, that there's spaces for students to reflect on their own learning, their strategies that they're using, what they're learning, and what support that they still need. So that's one way in terms of thinking about how we can try and create more connectivity, more of a connection with our students. Another option comes from Kansky Brocky in terms of thinking about our first impressions with our students. So what is the kind of, so perhaps something for you to think about is what kind of first impression are you creating as a lecturer with your students? In a blended approach, what we often say is that in addition to creating a warm, welcoming space in the classroom, is that you also create a similar warm, welcoming space in the online course, like in Ulwazi or Teams or wherever it is. And so, for example, providing an introduction video where you introduce yourself, talk about the course, the importance of what it is that you expect from your students is really helpful in terms of getting your students getting to get a sense of who you are and fostering that connection between them. Something, particularly with the online space, using video helps to convey things like emotion, humor, and self-disclosure, which is more than, for example, just a textual description might do it. We know the importance of a syllabus, and often these are sort of documents that we provide to students at the start of a course. But rather than being a typical PDF that you send students, a liquid syllabus is something that's online. It's fluid because it is mobile friendly, so students can read it on a cell phone wherever they are. It's something that you can update as the course progresses if there's things that need to be updated. And it helps just to clarify and continue to form expectations over the course. So rather than thinking about it just as a document that's sent out to students before the course or at the start of the course, to think about making it something that's more of a living document that students can access from wherever they are. And I think also think about the language that you use. And again, it's difficult with many students. But for example, if you have a group of students that have missed one of the assignments, if you send an email says with a heading that says assignments missing versus for example, things saying just checking if everything is okay, it gives a very different tone and a very different position in terms of thinking about the relationship and the connection with students. Okay. And then another tip is to think about ways in getting to know your students. Again, to get students to feel more connected, and therefore, if they're more connected, they feel more engaged, is to think about how do we get to know our students. And this is for them to get to know you and for you to get to know them. So again, it is difficult sometimes with larger classes, but what I encourage lecturers to do is to do a survey of the students right at the front in terms of thinking about who their students are, what their needs are, what their expectations are. You can ask them about, for example, their learning goals, their learning backgrounds, experiences, what technology they have, what will help. One of the next one is included, which I really like including as a question in such a survey, is thinking about, what is something that might interfere with the success in your course? And again, students have many different commitments and responsibilities. They might have time pressures, they might have family commitments, they might have issues in terms of transport or whatever it is, but helping students think through what are the things that might cause them not to succeed, and also thinking through what are some of the things that they can do themselves, as well as use lectures to try and support them in their journey, is really helpful. And then thirdly is to then think about, in terms of your students, based on your survey, based on your interactions in class or wherever you are there students that may need more support than most, or are there students who would benefit from additional support mechanisms? And so it helps you to start to think about who are the students that may need additional support, and what kinds of support are you able to provide for them. Okay, so that was the first C, which is around connections, and hopefully you've got some ideas in terms of thinking about how we can foster greater connections to establish better engagement. The next C, or C2, is thinking about consistency of experience. And again, similar to this, really comes down to, in terms of thinking about how we design our courses, is that are students going through a similar learning experience? For example, when they move from course to course, from rotation to rotation, are they going through a similar use of what there is expected? Is there similar terminology? Is there similar structure of the Owazi site? Is there information or resources found in similar places, or do they have to go and hunt for things that they need to go for? For example, if one lecturer in a course says, for this part of the course, you need to post a reply to a discussion forum, and then the next lecture comes around and says, okay, I want you to then go and respond to the discussion boards. It's a very small, minor thing, but it could end up as an example of the kinds of things that students then get confused about. It then causes uncertainty, and again, that uncertainty then means they feel like they're ending up lost and might want to disengage. And again, for example, if one lecturer places all the materials in one space and another lecturer places them sort of in many different spaces, again, it's very difficult for students to know where to find things. So we need to think about consistency, not just in how we use our technologies, but also thinking about the technology itself. So again, not all students have access to good devices or the right software or good connectivity, and thinking about finding ways to support these students is important. For example, some students may only be able to access things from a mobile phone rather than a sort of desktop or laptop, and so they may be struggling in terms of things that you want to see in a bit more detail. And again, particularly if you're dealing with sort of first-year students or students coming into university, they're also going to need time to learn about the technologies and how to use the technologies, and then need the support. It's very important, you can't just expect students to come in and know how to use them, but for particular learning purposes, to help to think about what sort of support you're providing to help them to learn how to use the required technologies. So that's about consistency. The third C is around engagement with content. So this is around content. And again, thinking about here, going back to course design, thinking about how your course is designed, how the course is related to other courses in the program, whether it's designed at the right level and whether it's designed at the appropriate level. So often people need to think about how they structure the courses in terms of how they chunk them up, not providing, for example, too much information for students to go through in one time, thinking about what's the appropriate level, not providing content that's either sort of too easy or too difficult for students at that particular time, but thinking about the sort of overall spacing and pacing of your course. Another important thing to think about in terms of putting your content into smaller pieces so that students can maybe do that in shorter bursts when they have a moment or two, rather than, for example, a couple of hours set aside time to study. They may have, for example, 20 minutes here, 20 minutes there. What can they do in those sessions, but in a way that also maintains consistency, that they can see the links between what they're doing? And then the content in the course should also feel relevant and applicable to students, or else they will disengage. So again, thinking about the content, is it relevant to what students need to learn? Is it applicable to what their students learn? So again, these things force us to think about carefully about how we design our courses for our students. Again, some tips in terms of thinking about humanizing interactions. So again, thinking about here, again, particularly for the online component of a blended course, is that rather than just engaging with students on a textual basis through chat or through discussions, making use of videos or audio to support the core content. Again, perhaps reinforcing what you're covering in class, or preparing students if you're taking a flipped class approach before they come to class. Thinking about giving feedback in different ways. Most of us concentrate on textual feedback, but we can also give audio feedback, video feedback, and other forms of feedback as well. And then another important thing is to think about how do we actually track engagement, for example, in the LMS through using analytics. And I'm not going to talk about that today because that's something that in next week's session, Shane and May from CLTD will be joining the session to talk about using the learning analytics tool, the new analytics tool in Ulwazi. So if you're interested in that, please join next week Tuesday session. And then C4 is about effective community. So we've spoken about the importance of learners not feeling isolated, because again, isolation means I feel that I might want to disengage. And so how do we create opportunities for students to engage and to collaborate with their peers? If we can try and think about ways in which we can help students to foster relationships with their peers, that then supports the development of their learning and then the development of the engagement. So thinking about things such as how do we make use of group projects? Are there support groups, whether formal or informal, that we can recommend for students to support each other? One of the major aspects to consider, or frameworks in this area, is the community of inquiry framework. So if you want to, maybe in the chat, just put a Y or an N for me if you're familiar, if you've heard of, or if you're familiar with the community of inquiry framework before, just to give me a sense of how much detail to go into. But really, this is about community of inquiry comes from the early 2000s. Around thinking about, as we at that time was just internet-based, internet learning management systems were just starting to be formulated. Okay, so thank you. I see a lot of people saying no, so I'll go through in a bit of detail. So this community of inquiry framework, it's talking about thinking about how do we design and facilitate learning environments that enable our students to engage meaningfully through collaboration and through purposeful inquiry? So it focused saying that in order to develop a community of inquiry where students are able to have a learning environment that is supportive and that promotes inquiry and engagement, we need to think about three presences and how those three presences interact. So the first one is social presence, then there's teaching presence, and there's cognitive presence as well. So these three presences need to each be thought about on their own, but also more importantly in terms of how they're together. So again, the importance of thinking about is that learning takes place, or education takes place within a broader social, emotional environment. And so thinking about social presence is, how do students feel in terms of that they feel that they are part of a community, and that they're able to show themselves as represent themselves as participants who are part of this community. And we'll talk about some of the ways in which we can do that. Then the other one is around teaching presence, and this is really the more familiar part of the model of the framework for all lecturers, is how do we design educational experiences for our students, and how do we facilitate those experiences or activities for our students. And then the third one is around cognitive presence, and that's the area in which we're thinking about how do we support students to think about how they construct their learning, and how do they make meaning of what it is that we are teaching them, and how are they able to communicate what they are learning and communicate with others within this learning environment. So those are the three presences that, working together, allow us to create a climate for learning that allows students to be able to regulate their own learning, and allow us and our students together to create a supporting discourse that encourages them to then have a positive or successful educational experience. So if you haven't heard of the community of inquiry model before, I'm going to give you two resources. The first one is a YouTube video that's just 12 minutes. It's really nice. So if you don't have a lot of time and you want to just get a quick overview of what the community of inquiry model is all about, I'm putting that into the chat. That's a really nice, useful YouTube video that just introduces the community of inquiry framework and talks about how you can implement it in your own teaching practice. If you do have more time and you are more interested in sort of unpacking and understanding the framework, there's a really useful book called Teaching and Learning Environments that's based on using the community of inquiry framework. It's a little bit old now, it's from 2013, but it's still a useful resource in terms of thinking about how we structure our courses, blended courses, using this sort of framework. So just to briefly talk about the three presences, what are the things that we can do to try and foster engagement in our students? The first one around teaching presence, talks about how do we design our course, and then how do we facilitate on the course. So this thinks about, in terms of the design and organization, is sort of what content are we selecting? What sort of activities are we expecting students to do? What sort of assessments are we expecting from our students? And then thinking about our role as facilitators, thinking about how do we facilitate discourse and reflection, and thinking about how do we actually present or facilitate the content that we've selected, the outcomes that we want to achieve. So what sort of things are we showing our students? How are we engaging with our students? What questions are we asking students to think about, and we want responses at? How do we guide discussions? How do we sort of summarize key learning points from there? And that's tied in terms of the sort of direct instruction approach that most of us are familiar with in terms of in being in classrooms with students. Then the cognitive presence thinks about how do we help students to develop higher order thinking processes, and looks at it from a perspective of going through a sort of four phases of having a sort of triggering event where we identify some problem or some issue that we want to inquire about further. Then exploration, how do students then explore that activity? So what resources do we give them to explore? What tasks do we give them to think about, either collaborative tasks or individual tasks? How are they expected to talk about this or explore what this event that they need to learn on? The integration is where students start to construct their own meaning based on what they are learning. They're kind of taking ideas from what they've learned from the exploration phase, from the resources that they're given. They've started to put these together. And then resolution is when students, and this is typically the assessment process, where students are able to apply what they've learned to context or to a workplace environment, for example, and actually see whether they actually are able to apply what it is that you want to learn. So that's the process of the cognitive presence. Social presence then talks about things around how do we then encourage students to become familiar with each other, to be able to feel safe and enough to be able to ask questions in class, or to be able to send, to put up their hand and say, I don't understand something? And how do we start to then form group cohesion in terms of getting students to work together, getting them to feel comfortable to reach out to each other? And the important part about this as well is in terms of understanding the expectations, how people express themselves, the emotional or affective aspect as well, and how that's brought into and possible issues around misunderstandings there. Particularly in the online space, more so than a face-to-face environment, it takes time to develop that level of comfort and trust, so that it's easy for students to start to exchange ideas, to start to have that sort of feeling of camaraderie with other students, and to feel that they can explore with the lecturer. Okay. And then some tips for interaction here very quickly is just one of the nice things that I like to do at the start of a week is to just give a short postcard overview, so video, audio, text, of sort of where we are through the course, and helps to give sort of visual or sort of visual and non-visual sort of cues as to where students are and how they can engage with you. One of the things as well that's important is that if you want students to be able to share their vulnerabilities and experiences, you need to be open and honest enough as a lecturer to be able to share your own vulnerabilities and experiences, whether positive or negative. And that way, through being more authentic, you can then encourage your students to do the same. Make use of discussions, whether that's in Teams or WASI, that discussions are not just seen as something that only happens in the classroom, but can happen online as well. And then try, and again, this is more difficult for large classes, but thinking about how students can reach you privately as well as publicly, and how you respond in different ways through email, messages, etc. Okay, and the last C is compassion. And that's thinking about how do we show compassion to our students where they just are not coping with what is required. How do we support them if they just aren't able to prioritize what we want them to prioritize? They aren't keeping up with what we need them to be doing. Or if students are going through a difficult time, whether they're going through personal or family health issues, how do we help them to work around what sort of empathy and understanding that we can show to provide some form of flexibility in terms of deadlines and assessment requirements? So one of the things that we hear that's a nice thing to do is at either in the LMS in Ulwazi or even Teams or a Google Doc is at the end of a course, I like to get students to write about their reflections from the course and sort of use it as a sort of wisdom wall. And you yourself as the lecturer can also post your own reflections, your own learnings, and then really have the opportunities to think about collectively on the experiences, and then use that or use those reflections as something that you can start with the next cohort of students to think about, and using that as a basis or advice on sort of things the students that found that sort of helped them, that enabled their learning, or they felt constrained their learning. Okay, so just in summary, if we try and find ways of addressing each of the 5 C's, so through connection, consistency, community, and compassion, we may be able to show that to our students in terms of demonstrating care, and therefore allowing our students to feel slightly more positive about their learning experience and more likely to stay engaged. So I've just put up 2 questions here that to start the discussion around how do we as academics try and humanize interactions more with our students, and how do we try and foster a sense of community in our own context. But you're welcome to ask. I'm opening it up for now discussion. Anyone's welcome to ask any questions or provide any comments that they want to at this time. So you can either type your questions or comments into the chat, or you're welcome to put up your hand and unmute yourself. Yes, Mervyn.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody, and especially to you, Greg. And thank you very much for an excellent overview of the demands that we actually have to meet. I'm a clinician, and I deal with a particular group of students who have had, unfortunately, very limited clinical exposure. And this is the Nelson Mandela Fidel Castro group, who were exposed in Cuba, but haven't had much practical opportunity here. Now, the issues that you raised, which touched me particularly, were those of practice and integration, which, as you can appreciate in a clinical environment, are exceptionally important. The students are academically reasonably sound, and they can ingest and regurgitate fact. But many of the clinical scenarios that we teach them, they don't have an opportunity to practice because they may not be exposed to them. And therefore, their logic in terms of applying knowledge is lacking. So my rather verbose introduction to my question is, how do we give them the opportunity to understand the academia and expose them to the practice and therefore integrate their knowledge into a clinical environment? I'm so sorry I've been long-winded, but you can appreciate the complexity of the problem. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you. No, I can surely appreciate the complexity of that. I don't think there is necessarily in that case, a sort of simple answer to say, we can do this, and then our students will start to be able to do it. I think there are a couple of things that you can do, but again, it depends. I would probably need a better understanding of the context, but just some general things to think about is ways in which the knowledge and the practice are integrated. So as a lecturer, are there ways in which you can facilitate students to make the connection between the conceptual and the practice that they may not be seeing themselves? And again, that's difficult because I know many of our curricula are sort of packed. We've got a lot of things that we need to cover. We don't always have time to spend on certain topics as much as we would like to. And again, it's difficult, but they think about the level of conceptual and sort of knowledge versus what is practice, or what is the practical, and how that's integrated. Are you as a lecturer providing enough opportunities for practice? If you aren't, are there other ways in which that can be supported? Maybe not necessarily in a clinical environment, because that might be difficult, but are there ways potentially to perhaps simulate some of those? I don't want to go into too much detail because I feel like I don't really know your context enough to be able to say, but I think what is important here is I think you are asking the right question here in terms of thinking about, it's not just about whether students know how to do something or not, but it's whether they know how to do something in a context and whether they can make decisions. They have the competencies to make decisions based on the information that's available in their context. And if we can provide our students with ways in which thinking about that, so that the sort of disconnect between the knowledge and the practice is lower, I think that does help with engagement. If you haven't already, Mervyn, I know it's difficult and maybe difficult, but maybe reach out to some of the other support mechanisms in the faculty. Yanis can perhaps guide you better than I can in terms of ways, others that you can have these discussions with, that maybe can have a bit more of a detailed discussion with and provide some more concrete solutions than I can at this time. Thank you. I'll just check it. Okay, I'll just check if there's any other. I don't see any other hands raised. I feel like I have spoken a lot today, and it sort of went over a bit more than what I wanted to do. But I think it's okay. I see, yes, another hand. This from Nkanyanya, if you want to come in.
Okay, yes, thanks so much.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation here. It does help us, for some of us who are sitting in outlying areas, because I'm sitting in Klerksdorp here,
yeah,
where of course when it comes to teaching, the challenges would be in the form of the infrastructure for the students themselves. And sometimes human resource becomes an issue because the very specialists or lecturers or people who should be teaching the students are overstretched.
Yes.
So,
yes.
but
yes.
the overstretched means that there are patients to see. And so ordinarily, when students are brought in, and in the case or whatever the disease, the topic to be discussed is being practicalized, and that they can attach what they see to what they hear, then it makes learning a little bit, it makes learning easier, and they normally look forward to that if they see that they are definitely being engaged and they are not seen as a nuisance when they are present. When they are present.
Yes, I think that's so important, because if students feel like that they are, that, you know, and I appreciate, as a clinician you have multiple responsibilities and you do have, for example, patients to see, but if students feel that they are there as just as a nuisance, as something on the side, and not important, it does also then affect in terms of how they feel about engaging with you, and that also then does affect your learning. So I think that's important to think about our sort of approaches and our interactions with students, just how we interact with them, the kinds of language that we have, and whether we have, and I know it's difficult in terms of whether we have time to actually listen to and respond to what they're saying, rather than just carrying on with what we need to. So I think that's important. And again, you raised the key thing here of there's many things that we'd like to do with our students, but because of constraints that we face in terms of infrastructure, in terms of our own time, may not be possible. But thinking about sort of small changes perhaps that we can make just in our interactions, in our dealings with students, that can maybe have a sense of sort of allow them to have a more positive learning experience, which would hopefully then mean that they then have a more successful learning experience. Okay, thank you so much for that comment. Yanis, we've got about 15 minutes, so I wanted us to go into breakout rooms and just give people a chance to unpack some of the ideas that we're talking about, and to learn a little bit more about the community of inquiry framework. So we're going to go into breakout rooms now. We're going to assign, I think it's just randomly assign you to one of 3 breakout rooms. The first room is going to look at teaching presence. The second room is going to look at cognitive presence. And then the third room is going to look at social presence. We're going to make use of a Google Jamboard for this, so I'm putting that into the chat. So what I'd like you to do is in each example of those presences, I've given you a list of some examples of how to build or foster that presence. I'd like you to look at some of those elements, and on the Jamboard, just brainstorm some suggestions in which you can think about how can I improve this particular presence in my course, using the sticky notes to do so. And we'll do that for about 10 minutes. Okay, so Yanis, if you can put us into into 3 different breakout rooms. Room 1 will look at teaching presence, room 2 will look at cognitive presence, and room 3 will look at social presence. Hi everyone, welcome back. I know that was a very quick activity and probably not a lot of time to think about some ideas, but I'm happy to see that each of the groups came up with some ideas on how they could think about the different presences. So I'm just going to briefly, we've got 5 minutes left, just quickly highlight some of the ideas. We'll keep this Jamboard open, that you're welcome to sort of come back to it and look at it again if you wanted to. But some of the ideas in terms of thinking from the room 1 was around teaching presence. And so here I was looking at thinking about how do we encourage our students to engage and debate. And so some ideas in terms of using things like Kahoot or board games to get students working in a team and have more fun when they're learning. Getting students involved in defining what the learning outcomes are for particular sessions, getting students up front to understand, there's often a lot of detail when it comes into particular topic. What's the sort of take-home messages that students are they not just looking at what they're learning, but also why and the reasons for it. Some good ideas in terms of getting debates in class happening through getting students to take a side, a pro or an against, and arguing against getting different things there. Making use of a humor and difficult because we often have different senses of humor, but it's just ways in which we can get some more context for our students to understand what it is that we're looking at, and then using examples of sort of clinical cases to illustrate what we're covering in particular concepts. So that was room 1. Room 2, I see lots of things happening here in terms of cognitive presence, getting students to think about being more prepared to handle and facilitate social interaction, thinking about how you communicate, model setting, making sure the content is both accessible, but also how do you get students to think about more deeply about what it is that they're learning, so that they're not taking a sort of surface approach, and how to handle the questions that come up in the discussion. So these are thinking about acknowledging, I like this one, and sort of acknowledging the emojis and the memes that students post. So recognizing that there's more to students than just the sort of learning, and that sometimes those more sort of effective components can actually support learning as well. And allowing our personalities to shine through as well, I think, is also important. And then social presence, some ideas here in terms of ground rules from the onset. So I think that's important as well. Getting students to understand the expectations of what is sort of the behavior that you're looking for and what you're not looking for, and making sure that students feel like it is a safe space that they can ask the questions that they want to. Sensitizing colleagues around what does it mean to create and facilitate that safe space, because it is not easy to set up a safe space, and it's very easy to have something that comes along and breaks it. Using icebreakers and team building exercise to get rapport between the lecturers and students is a nice one as well. And then getting students to work in smaller groups is really nice as well. So those are some great ideas coming through there. Hopefully these are some things that you can either yourself, you can build on those, or you can perhaps look at some of the ideas that other people have put in and see whether you can perhaps apply some of those things to your own context. I just want to wrap up now. So the last thing that I wanted to share was just this slide. And again, we've covered a lot of topics today, and I do know that sort of next week with Shane and May, you're looking at one particular aspect of what we've looked at today, which is learning analytics. And I think Lizelle the following week, if I saw correctly, will cover some more actions and steps that you can take in terms of around engagement. But just as a takeaway for today, in the last sort of minutes, just to think about, is there something, just choose one of the C's. You don't have to think about all 5 C's at this point, but just to one of the C's. Is there something that you can do or change in your teaching practice in the next short while, even if it's a very small, very minor change, just in terms of maybe how you approach students, how you talk to students, or what tools that you use? Is there a way in which you can think about enhancing either the connection with your students, the consistency of your course and your teaching experience, the content that you've selected, how to build the community hub, and how to demonstrate compassion? So I'll just leave you with that thought for you to think about and for you to reflect on, just making a very small change in how you can do that going forward. And these are just some references that you can look at if you're interested in more information about that. Okay, thanks very much. That's me, Yanis. I think then I'm done for today. Thank you very much, and thanks for everyone for participating today. And thanks again for inviting me. Thank you.